Good evening, everyone. Welcome to class 62 on our journey through the Abrahamic religions, focusing now on nearing the climax of the revelation of Bahá'u'lláh with the revelation of the Kitab-i-Aqdas that we will pick up with in a couple of meetings. Tonight, we're going on another journey with Bahá'u'lláh, this time from Adrianople to Akká, and it may seem like that's not a lot of information to have a full class just on that, but I think you'll find that in fact it's pretty interesting for a number of reasons that I hope to share. So let me share my screen. I'm going to first show you some pictures that are most of what the slides are going to be about. And then I'm going to read to you a narrative about this journey from the second book I wrote in 1980, 42 years ago, called Ali's Dream, which is a children's book, but I'm going to read just the narrative by Ali's grandfather as he describes to Ali that journey. So I've left out some of the questions that Ali asked and so forth. But it's something that I put together largely for junior youth, though I find it quite readable for adults as well, insofar as putting together a fairly succinct but still substantially detailed portrait of the life of Bahá'u'lláh. So tonight we're going to study the journey from Adrianople to Akká, titled Banners of Light, and you'll see why that title is relevant to the journey. So we start out in Adrianople, and every little dot you see on this map, and this is a map I've shared with you before that is available online, and if you can go in very tight on it and see all of the places that Bahá'u'lláh either stopped or resided for a while. So we begin from Adrianople, and then they walk from Adrianople to Gallipoli, and that's a very familiar peninsula to those of you who know anything about the First World War, because there was a very famous battle there. And then they get on a steamer in Smyrna, in Gallipoli. They stop in Smyrna for reasons you will discover. And then they go down here to Alexandria in Egypt, where Nabil is imprisoned, and Nabil sees Bahá'u'lláh and the believers, something he had been promised would occur by Bahá'u'lláh. They then stop again, get on board another steamer and stop at Port Said in Egypt. And then after Port Said, they go to Jaffa, which was in Palestine. And the port of Jaffa, they go, the same steamer goes to the port of Haifa, where they get on board a sailboat, and it takes them 4 hours, even though it's only 9 miles across the bay. They go from Haifa to Akká and enter the prison city through the sea gate. And so we're going to see some pictures, some of which I've showed you before. And the reason they're the same pictures I've showed you before, as I mentioned when I showed them to you, is that in Adrianople, when they were exiled to Akká, the thought was on the part of both Nasir-ad-Din Shah and the Sultan Abdulaziz, as well, of course, of his Grand Minister, that this would be the end of both the Baha'i faith and certainly of Bahá'u'lláh, because he would be in this obscure prison city from which he would never escape. And of course, he died a prisoner there, so he spent the rest of his life as officially a prisoner, even though in a while he was allowed to leave the confines of the city. So the reason these pictures are relevant to this is that they were all taken after the edict was delivered that they should be 75 of them, Bahá'u'lláh and about 75 others, were exiled to Akká. Then some of them went across the bay from Haifa to Akká, and the rest went from, and this includes Mirza Yahya, and along with some of the faithful believers, such as Mishkin Kalim, to the island of Cyprus. And there's some great irony in that for a number of reasons. But at any rate, so that was sort of the end of Mirza Yahya's influence. So all of these pictures were basically, as I said before, passport pictures. And that is, these pictures were made so that the officials, as they were moved, could identify who was a member of this group of what they perceived to be troublemakers. So I've mentioned before, this is Syed Muhammad of Isfahan, the prime mover behind Mirza Yahya. This is Mirza Musa, who is the faithful brother of Bahá'u'lláh. This is a picture of Mirza Yahya about the same period. Notice how strangely he's dressed. And if you remember, he loved to wear these disguises. I think he's dressed here as a dervish, but I'm not sure. But he would dress in Arab garb and so on, so that he wouldn't be found out that he was a Persian and, in effect, a Babi. And quite a strange look on his face. I'll show you another picture as we move along, not tonight, when he's much older. This was the picture. And again, you see the solemnity on their faces because they know what these pictures are being taken for. They know that they are being exiled again into much worse circumstances than their present circumstances in Adrianople, because in the same way that the townspeople had come to love them in Baghdad, the same thing had occurred in Adrianople. So Mírzá Mihdí on the left and Abdul Baha at the age 24 on the right. This is a group photo consisting of a number of the believers. I won't attempt to show them all to you, but two that, of course, this is Mishkin Kalim. He's a tall, slender one, and that's not his formal name. That's his title. It means the musk-scented pen. He's the calligrapher who did the greatest name, not the ring symbol, but the script version of Ya Bahá'u'lláh. This is Mirza Muhammad, excuse me, the amanuensis of Bahá'u'lláh, Abul Qasim. I'm forgetting the name. This is Nabil, the historian. This is Kuli, Muhammad Kuli, Baha'u'llah's half-brother, who was faithful, and a lot more information we'll learn about him. This is, and you can see he's kind of deformed. He's got very short limbs and so on. But this is, here's another picture of him here. He's 16 at this point. This is Mirza Muhammad Ali, who would become the inveterate enemy of Abdul Baha, and he was the desired to have the authority that Abdul Baha did. I have this title, The Prophet's Daughter, by Janet Khan. It's an excellent book, and the importance of it is this. The reason I'm showing it tonight, the importance is that it's a very good book about Bahia Khanum, the greatest holy leaf, is that in this book, she explains the sort of behind the scenes role that women had. And so we don't see in this any women. Why is that? Because they were considered more or less property, and they were, I mean, not by the Baha'is or the Babis, certainly, but in effect, they, you know, especially since a man could have as many as 4 wives and so on, and they could divorce them by simply saying, I divorce you, and so on. And so they really were not expected to have any sort of prominent active role in anything other than keeping the house. This is the port of Alexandria, about the same time as all this occurred, and you can see a lot of sailing ships. And this is what the steamers looked like. They sailed from Gallipoli on a steamer, and these are the kinds of steamers. This is, I think, at Alexandria, the port of Alexandria. It looked like some of the versions of the river boats on the Mississippi, don't they? The same kind of flat bottom boats. I don't know if they had the stern wheel or not. I don't remember. I think they did. This is the port of Jaffa in Palestine, and this is also from that same period. And this is a drawing, but a fairly accurate one, of Haifa. And you see the Templar colony at the foot of the hill. And of course, there wasn't anything on the mountain there, and you can barely see Akká in the distance. And these, of course, mostly sailing ships. And so this is the port here, and this is where they got on the sailboat and went there. At least those who were with Bahá'u'lláh, they separated those who would go with Mírzá Mihdí, and we'll read about that. And of course, this is a contemporary picture of Akká, though it's a picture taken before some of the more recent changes in the city. So this still looks pretty much the way it did in the time of Bahá'u'lláh. This is the sea gate here. And so they pulled up as close as they could get, considering all these rocks and so forth, and went in through the sea gate, where all the townspeople gathered to see these Persian prisoners and exiles whom they thought were ruffians and so on, and jeered at them and so on. And so you have the manifestation of God entering in these lowly circumstances, being jeered by the people of the town. This is a passageway in Akká, and it was stigmatized by Bahá'u'lláh as the people were as a generation of vipers, and says the city was devoid of any water within its gates, was flea infested, damp, and honeycombed with gloomy, filthy, and tortuous lanes. Bahá'u'lláh, in his letter to the Sultan of Turkey, wrote that Akká was the most desolate of the cities in the world, the most unsightly of them in appearance, the most detestable in climate, and the foulest in water. It is as though it were the metropolis of the owl. This is another vision of or picture of the sea gate. And this is another, just to give you a sense of what the streets, the narrow streets meandering around inside the city. Those of you who've been on pilgrimage there have probably walked these streets. These are this is a picture taken in the very early 1900s, and this prison had not changed much. It obviously hadn't been kept up. This is the courtyard of the barracks. And then this is the walkway going up to the prison floor, the second floor, which is where the prison was. Of course, originally, remember, this was a citadel, a barracks for soldiers, and it was used so after Bahá'u'lláh and his companions were taken out of the prison. This is that same stairway as it is today. As you can see, the Baha'is have refined it and refinished it, as they have all of the historic buildings that we have been able to acquire. This is the way the prison cell of Bahá'u'lláh looked at the time of Bahá'u'lláh, or shortly thereafter. You can see the conditions of it. And this is the view out the window here. This is what Bahá'u'lláh could see. Could lean his head a little bit, he could perhaps see Mount Carmel over to the left, though you can't see it from here. And this is a blueprint of the prison. And so Bahá'u'llah's cell is here. Here's the stairway going up to in the entrance. This is the skylight through which Mírzá Mihdí fell to his death. This is Bahá'u'llah's cell, and this is the common area. And then when visitors would come, they were not allowed to visit Bahá'u'lláh, but they would go to the outer wall, and Bahá'u'lláh would wave to the pilgrims through these two windows here. This is, excuse me, I'm going backwards here. This is the cell the way it looks today. It's, of course, been refinished and refined by the Baha'is. Beautiful carpet on the floor and flooring refinished. This is the El Jassar Mosque, and it was here that a lot of things took place, but among them is this was where the townspeople were gathered and the sentence of Bahá'u'lláh and the other prisoners was announced to the populace of the city. They were then taken to the prison. Now, this is a picture taken, as you can see, in 1907, and this is the way it looked then. So you can imagine, since this was only a few decades after Bahá'u'lláh lived there, you can see how decadent it is and so on. And one of the reasons it was so awful and that the infestation and the smell was so odious is at that time the seawater would rush. This was a moat right here in this area. And this is a closer view of the moat where the seawater would rush in, and as it would recede, of course, at low tide, it would leave behind a very awful smell. This is the gate, the formal entrance to the prison. And these are Ottoman Turk soldiers who were guarding the prison at the time. So here you can see that passageway that we were just looking at, and this entrance here, and here's Bahá'u'llah's cell up here, and here are the windows through which they would wave at the pilgrims who could get about 200 feet to the left here. They could get that close. This is the skylight through which Mírzá Mihdí was doing his meditations, fell through the skylight to his death. And I thought I had the picture of you can see a little of it here, of the memorial plaque that is now there. None of this was there when I went on pilgrimage in 1972, but it has all been beautifully refined. This is the land gate that I show you, just so you can see there were two gates to the city. And this is important. It becomes important later in the next couple of classes because Syed Ali Mohammed of Isfahan was with another Azali, another follower of Mirza Yahya, were placed at an apartment right near the gate here on the other inside of it, so they could spy anyone that was a Babi or a Baha'i and turn them into the government, and they would be kicked out of the city. So they would try to come in disguise and so on. And as you will find out in a later class, 7 of the Baha'is who just couldn't take it anymore, very unwisely and against the explicit orders of Bahá'u'lláh, murdered them, took their lives. Bahá'u'lláh himself, as attested by Nabil in his narrative, had, as far back as the first years of his banishment in Adrianople, alluded to that same city in his La-i-Sayan, designating it as the Vale of Nabil, the word Nabil being equal in numerical value to that of Akká. Upon our arrival, that tablet had predicted, we were welcomed with banners of light, whereupon the voice of the Spirit cried out, saying, soon will all that dwell on earth be enlisted under these banners. So you've probably all, or many of you, heard this song. It's pretty old now, but soon will all that dwell on earth be enlisted under these banners. Well, it's referring to these banners of light from the spiritual world welcoming Bahá'u'lláh to this most great prison. And why is it called the most great prison? His arrival at the penal colony of Akká, far from proving the end of his affliction, was but the beginning of a major crisis characterized by bitter suffering, severe restrictions, and intense turmoil, which in its gravity surpassed even the agonies of the Siyachal in Tehran, and to which no other event in the history of the entire century can compare except the internal convulsion that rocked the faith in Adrianople. And there he's alluding to, this is Shoghi Effendi alluding to the days of stress and the most great separation that we've discussed in previous classes. Know thou, Bahá'u'lláh, wishing to emphasize the criticalness of the first 9 years of his banishment to that prison city, has written, upon our arrival at this spot, we chose to designate it as the most great prison, though previously subjected in another land, Tehran, to chains and fetters, we yet refuse to call it by that name. Say, ponder thereon, O ye endued with understanding. In other words, think about it. Why do you think I did that? The proclamation of his mission had been, as already observed, directed particularly to the kings of the earth, who by virtue of the power and authority they wielded were invested with the peculiar and inescapable responsibility for the destinies of their subjects. Remember, this was still so far the age of kings and emperors and empires. It was to these kings, as well as to the world's religious leaders, who exercised a no less pervasive influence on the mass of their followers, that the prisoner of Akká directed his appeals, warnings and exhortations during the first years of his incarceration in that city. Upon our arrival in this prison, he himself affirms, we purpose to transmit to the kings the messages of their Lord, the mighty, the all-praised. Though we have transmitted to them in several tablets that which we were commanded, yet we do it once again as a token of God's grace. Now, this is very important because it relates to the fact that in Adrianople, he had already sent out many letters. He had already composed the letter to the Shah, but it hadn't been delivered yet. And so that's part of what he's referring to. So that's the end of the slides. So let me take a sip of tea, and then I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to read to you, and you can read along if you wish, or just, oh, well, excuse me, I'm not sharing the screen, so you can't see it, but what do you think, Alex? Should I share the screen or just read it?
Yeah, if you have the slides available, if you have any visual component available, then sharing it will be great. But otherwise, you can just go for it.
Okay, no, I can, let me put it in a read mode, and then let me share the screen. And we will start reading. All right, hold on, let me take my tea, because this is, now, as I said, this is an excerpt from Ali's Dream, a book written for junior youth, but it's the grandfather of Ali describing him to him this particular part in the story of the life of Bahá'u'lláh. The Baha'is, and this goes now, we're starting all the way back at the beginning when the edict is rendered. The Baha'is did not know about the Sultan's decree until one morning troops of soldiers surrounded the house of Akká, where Bahá'u'lláh was living. The soldiers told the startled Baha'is that they would have to prepare to leave at once. The house was guarded so closely that Bahá'u'llah's family was not even allowed to leave to get food to take with them. They were not told where they were to be taken or what would happen to them. Most presumed they were going to be tortured and killed. When the neighbors saw the troops surrounding the house, they all became extremely upset, because whether they were Christians or Muslims, they all loved and respected Bahá'u'lláh, whom they now considered their most trusted friend. Shortly, they were ready. What belongings they could not carry with them were auctioned off. Quickly, the word spread to official representatives of other countries who were living in Adrianople, who became immediately concerned about the safety of Bahá'u'lláh. So they met Bahá'u'lláh at Bahá'u'llah's house. Several of them offered to try to help Bahá'u'lláh, but he refused. And again, we talked about that in length last week. And we'll mention it again after we read this. When Khurshid Pasha, the governor of Adrianople, received the order that he must banish Bahá'u'lláh, he reacted the same way as the governor of Baghdad had. He was so ashamed that he could not bear to face Bahá'u'lláh to tell him these things. You see, the governor had been defending Bahá'u'lláh against the lies and false reports that the officials in Constantinople had concocted, because of Khurshid Pasha had great admiration and love for Bahá'u'lláh. So when he received the command that Bahá'u'lláh must be exiled, the governor sent another official to tell Bahá'u'lláh of the sad decree that Sultan Abdulaziz had issued. When the Baha'is heard the edict that they would be banished to the prison city of Akká, there was great fear and sorrow among them. They were given a list of those. Excuse me, hold on. I just lost my place. Okay. Where was I? They were giving us an issue.
Said they
Oh, I see. They were given a list of those Baha'is who would not be allowed to go with Bahá'u'lláh. When some of them, now this isn't the separation of the Baha'is from the Azalis, that comes later. This is just the few that turned out to be, as I say, about 75 who were allowed to go. When some of the Baha'is discovered that they were not on the list, they were so grief-stricken that some contemplated suicide. One of them tried to cut his own throat. It was a time of grief and panic. It even looked as if some would be forced to be separated from their families, and none of them knew whether they would live or die, whether they would be sent back to Persia to be tortured or put in prison. Bahá'u'lláh and his family set out from the city on August the 12th, 1868, accompanied by government soldiers. As they departed from Adrianople on their 4-day journey to the port of Gallipoli, people in the section of the town where they had lived gathered to bid Bahá'u'lláh an emotional farewell. They had come to love this family of exiles, and as Bahá'u'lláh passed by, some wept openly or knelt to kiss the hem of his robe because they knew he would never return. When they arrived at Gallipoli, some of the Baha'is from Constantinople were waiting to find out what was to be the fate of Bahá'u'lláh. It was only then that they learned the extent of the horrible decree. Bahá'u'lláh would be banished to Akká with his 2 brothers, Mírzá Musa and Mírzá Muhammad Kuli, and 1 servant. The rest were to be sent back to Constantinople. As you can imagine, the believers were horrified. Even Bahá'u'lláh was unable to accept this decision. He insisted to the officials that at least some of the Baha'is be allowed to go with him. As a result of his protest, the decision was changed so that about 70 believers were allowed to accompany Bahá'u'lláh to Akká. However, while the government officials relented a little, they also decided to give one final insult to Bahá'u'lláh and the believers. They included in this group several followers of Mírzá Yahya, who were to act as spies for the officials. And among these spies was none other than Sayyid Muhammad himself, the very one who had instigated most of the problems in the first place. The Baha'is who were able to go with Bahá'u'lláh felt very fortunate, though Bahá'u'lláh told them in no uncertain terms before they departed that this journey would be far more severe than any of the previous exiles. But the believers chose to stay with him in spite of these warnings. And on the morning of August 21st, 1868, they set sail on an Austrian steamer headed for Alexandria, a seaport in Egypt. It was a wretched voyage from the beginning to the end, 10 days of going from ship to ship, from seaport to seaport. They did not have any proper clothing, and they had only the most meager supply of food, a little bread and cheese that they had managed to bring aboard. After only a day on the sea, one of Baha'u'llah's dearest companions, Janabi Munir, became seriously ill, and he had to be removed from the ship when it reached Smyrna. Abdu'l-Baha took Janabi Munir to a hospital on shore and then quickly went to purchase some fruit to help him recover. However, when Abdu'l-Baha returned to the hospital, he discovered that Janabi Munir had died. When Abdu'l-Baha returned to the ship, the Baha'is on board were greatly saddened by the news of this devoted believer's death. You see, this noble soul had become a Babi as a youth, and he had been with Baha'u'lláh since early in the Baghdad period. But there was still little time for grieving. 2 days later, they were forced to resume their journey to the port of Alexandria. The journey was rough, and when they reached Alexandria, they were removed from the ship without any idea of what was about to be done to them or where they were headed. What was worse, no one knew who would be allowed to continue with Baha'u'lláh and who would not. But travelers were exhausted from the rough seas, and many were quite ill. But the hand of God is always at work in such things. Within view of that port was a prison where Nabil the historian was being held. As Nabil looked out the narrow window of his cell, he was astonished to realize that he recognized one of his dear Baha'i friends. Then he realized that the entire band of prisoners was family and close companions of Baha'u'lláh. He called out in excitement to one of those nearest the window and asked what was happening. It was then he learned that Baha'u'lláh and his companions were being taken to prison in Akká. You can imagine how he longed to be free so that he could go with them. But alas, he was not. He would have to wait until he was released before he could make his own way to Akká to be with his beloved. But at least he now knew where he would travel as soon as he obtained his freedom. Before long, the Baha'is were transferred to a second ship. This ship was even more uncomfortable than the first. There was no place to lie down. The believers were weak from lack of food as they sailed along the Egyptian coast, arriving at Port Said by the next morning. Then that same evening, the ship set sail for Jaffa and finally to Haifa. Ali looked out across the water towards the cluster of buildings at the foot of Mount Carmel. He wondered what the ship had looked like as it entered the port of Haifa that day. He tried to imagine what the Baha'is on board the ship might have thought as they looked for the first time at Mount Carmel and the white walls of Akká across the bay. They were allowed to leave the boat when it arrived in Haifa, but only for a few hours. But before, and this is the grandfather speaking, but before I tell you what happened next, let's walk around to the sea gate, since that's where Baha'u'lláh and his companions first set foot in Akká. Now, Ali is living, this is in 1912, when Abdu'l-Baha is in the United States. And so Ali and his grandfather are living in Akká. And so the grandfather is showing him, taking him to the sea gate to show him where all this took place, because Ali really has not learned that much about the history of his own religion, and that's what the book is about his decision that he wants to know for himself what happened. When they arrived at the sea gate, Moyed, and Moyed is his grandfather, Moyed said it was terribly hot that day. Everyone was completely exhausted. Many were extremely ill. And as they were being taken to the landing stage in Haifa, a very sad thing happened. Abu Ghafar, I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Yes, maybe I am. A most devout believer discovered that he was among 4 faithful Baha'is who were going to be exiled to the island of Cyprus with Mirza Yahya. I suppose for the same reason they made Sayyid Muhammad of Isfahan and a few of his companions go with the faithful Baha'is to Akká. They probably thought that this way each group would make the other group miserable. But whatever their reasons were, Abu Ghafar was so distraught by this horrible news that he immediately leapt into the water and tried to drown himself, preferring death to being deprived of nearness to Baha'u'lláh. And Ali asked, did he drown? No, some of the friends pulled him out of the sea before it was too late. Then Baha'u'lláh tried to cheer up this hapless soul. He said to him in jest, why did you jump into the sea? Did you wish to give a banquet to the fishes? But Abu Ghafar could not be consoled. The idea of being separated from Bahá'u'lláh and the other Baha'is was more than he could bear. After several hours in Haifa, they were put into a small sailing vessel to take them the last few miles across the bay. But the wind was slight, and it took several hours in the hot sun before the boat arrived. By the time they arrived, all the townspeople of Akká had come to watch the Persian prisoners arrive. They wanted to see this god of the Persians, as some of the crude citizens of Akká mockingly called Bahá'u'lláh. The townspeople gathered at the sea gate. Some had to be carried from the Some had to be carried from the boat, but the citizens of Akká had little pity for the Baha'is, for they had been told that these exiles were infidels, non-believers, criminals, troublemakers. Later, the Farman, the edict of the Sultan, was read aloud to the townspeople at the mosque of Jazar Pasha, shortly after the Baha'is arrived. They were completely exhausted and miserable. They had no way of knowing what would happen next. The people were cursing them, yelling at them. They had been sentenced to lifelong imprisonment in a place hundreds of miles from their homeland and from anyone they knew. And when they were led through the streets of Akká to the barracks prison, you can be sure that any hope for relief that they may have had soon vanished. Moayed motioned that they should walk back towards the prison, taking a route through the center of the town past the mosque of Jazar Pasha, the way that Moayed thought the Baha'is might have taken. Before long, Moayed and Ali arrived at the barracks, which had served as the prison for Bahá'u'lláh and the companions, a building which Ali had seen all his life, but which now took on a special meaning. Moayed stopped and said to Ali, "I have a surprise for you, my son. During the past months, I have made friends with the guard there. He is on duty now, and he told me that it may be possible for us to take a quick walk up to the second floor so that we can see where Bahá'u'lláh and the other Baha'is were imprisoned." Ali's face lit up. He had never imagined that his grandfather had prepared such a special treat for him. Moayed approached the guard at the entrance to the old prison, spoke with him briefly, and both of them smiled as they looked at Ali. Then Moayed looked back and signaled for Ali to come with him. The guard had talked on several occasions with Moayed, and he had now come to respect Ali's grandfather and the Baha'is in general. So as Ali passed by him and greeted the guard, the tall soldier with his military hat and huge rifle smiled at the youth, and Ali felt a shiver run through the length of his spine as he and his grandfather walked to the wooden bridge that crossed the moat and led into the courtyard. As Ali followed his grandfather into the courtyard, he felt as though he were entering a different world, an enchanted place. For while he had seen this same building 1,000 times from every direction, he had never been inside the precincts of what to Ali was a most sacred place. Moayed knew exactly where to go, and he led Ali up the steps that ascended the side of the rough stone building. Ali immediately thought about the Siachal, where Bahá'u'lláh had also been imprisoned, but that was hundreds of miles away in Persia. So with each step that brought Ali closer to this place, where Bahá'u'lláh had dwelled for over 2 years, Ali's heart pounded more forcefully. At last they reached the top of the stairs, and Ali could see that they were almost next to the room where Bahá'u'lláh had been imprisoned. They could not go all the way inside, but Ali could see through a window in the door the inside of the second-story room. Then unexpectedly, a voice from behind the door said, "Care to come in?" A dark face appeared at the window. The guard at the gate said, you might come by. You may come inside if you wish." The voice was stern but friendly enough. And so Moayed and Ali went in. It was hard to see at first. It was cool and dark, but Ali could make out the room well enough. It was vacant and larger than he had imagined. There were windows with bars crossed, making them across them, looking out to the sea, the same windows he had seen from the other side when he sailed his boat. "We dare not stay long," Moayed whispered to Ali. "So look carefully and remember what you see." Almost immediately, Moayed pointed in the opposite direction from the windows towards the back of the room. "Remember that spot," he said softly. Then he nudged Ali towards the left of the door they had entered. And the spot he's pointing at, of course, is where Mírzá Mihdí had fallen to his death. The guards seemed occupied with other business and left them alone. "This is the room?" Ali asked with awe. "Yes," Moyed whispered. "This is the most great prison." Baha'u'llah's feet were on this floor, Ali thought. For 2 years, he was actually in this room. Ali felt a tingling sensation in his feet, and the room seemed to take on the same atmosphere and spirit he had sensed at the summer house. Now, the summer house he's referring to is they had previously visited the little house that is at one end of the Rizwan Gardens outside Akká. Ali surmised that he had felt these things only because of his love for Baha'u'lláh, yet the sensation was quite palpable. They stayed in the room for only a few minutes, though there were minutes Ali would always treasure. Then they thanked the guard and quietly left. They walked again across the courtyard, but when they got to the bridge, Ali stopped and looked down, trying to imagine how the moat looked in the time of Baha'u'lláh when the seawater would rush in at high tide. After they crossed the bridge, Moyed and Ali went down the path that led to the seawall. When they reached the wall, which was only about 200 yards away, they turned around and looked back at the prison building they had just left. For a moment, they were both silent. "Now that you have seen the prison, you will understand better what I am about to tell you," said Moyed, sitting down on a large stone step. All of the believers, all 70 of them, were crowded together in the confines of that top floor. It was gloomy and filthy. All of the horrible smells from the outgoing tide and the moat below sent up a sickening smell. The prisoners were completely exhausted from the hardships of their 10-day journey from Adrianople to Akká. And to add to all this misery, they were not allowed to have any food or drink that first night. "Not even water?" asked Ali. "No, nothing at all. And something else. Akká was then not as it is now. There was a saying that if a bird flew over Akká, it would die from the foul-smelling air that rose from this prison city. In fact, there was no fresh water in the whole town. The water in the courtyard pool, which the prisoners had to use, was so rank that no one could drink it. In the days that followed, the meager food they received consisted of just 3 loaves of black salty bread. Within a few days, all except 2 of them became horribly sick with malaria, dysentery, or one of the many other diseases that infested the dank air of the prison. When 3 of the Baha'is died soon afterwards, Baha'u'lláh gave the guards his own carpet that he had brought with him as a payment for them to give a proper burial to the friends. Later, Baha'u'lláh learned that the guards had kept the money they got for the sale of the carpet and buried the 3 believers without coffins or ceremony. Furthermore, because the edict of the Sultan had said that the Baha'is should be strictly imprisoned and kept from contact with the townspeople, the guards kept close watch over the Baha'is. It was several, it was several months before the governor of Akká saw fit to loosen these severe restrictions. By then, he had spoken several times with Abdul Baha, who was now a strikingly handsome young man of 24. The governor was very impressed with Abdul Baha's wisdom and sincerity. The governor had also talked with a Greek doctor who had become a friend of the Baha'is and who had told the governor about their sincerity and about the hardships they had endured. The governor gave the prisoners a little money so that one of them might go into the town accompanied by a soldier in order to buy some food fit to eat. The prisoners were still completely isolated from the townspeople and from the other Baha'is throughout Iraq and Persia. But when the Baha'is in other places received word that Baha'u'lláh and the family were in prison in Akká, almost immediately, many began traveling to this remote place in order to see their beloved.